Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. Or at least that's usually what we do. This week, I'm bringing you a little bonus extra episode because this week sees the UK release of one of my favourite movies of the year, the new Ben Wheatley horror movie, In the Earth. So in this episode, we're going to be talking all things In the Earth. I'm going to be joined by Rhianna Dhillon to discuss our thoughts on the movie. First of all, we will discuss our thoughts, completely spoiler-free, just our initial reactions to the film. Then you're going to hear a little interview with Mr. Ben Wheatley himself. Then, in the second half of this episode, me and Rhianna will discuss the movie in spoilerific detail, and included in the spoiler section is an interview with practical effects artist and long-term friend of the pod, Dan Martin, who made some of the gruesome, grisly body horror that features in this movie. So we've got Ben Wheatley, we've got Dan Martin, we've got some incredible guests and so much to talk about. So let's get started. You're about to hear my spoiler-free discussion of In the Earth with broadcaster, critic, journalist, presenter and my significant other, Rhianna Dhillon.
You told me his story. These are his memories. Can you feel him now? In the earth?
No, I don't know what you mean.
I think you do.
Welcome back, Rhianna Dhillon.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be talking about this because it was like my first trip to like an actual cinema that wasn't a press screening.
Yes.
And that made such a difference, genuinely. And it was a screening in my hometown of Brighton. Mm-hmm. Very cool, very special. At the Duke of York Cinema, which is the oldest, like, continuous running cinema in the UK.
Yeah. It's
been going for, over 100 years now. And you hosted a Q&A with Ben Wheatley there.
Yeah.
Afterwards. It was amazing. It's a very cool way to see a very cool film.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you, which we'll talk about in more depth. But the fact that it's released in cinemas, I think, is so good for this film. And what an awesome first film to see back on the big screen, which it is for a lot of people. I saw it at a press screening, but similarly, it was, I think, my first press screening. And just that experience of watching it on the big screen kind of blew my mind. So we'll talk about our thoughts, first of all, just sort of spoiler-free.
Sure.
So, yeah, and then after we've sort of warned people, we'll get into more specifics of like certain scenes that we liked or didn't like, and we can talk a bit about what we think of the final act of the film as well.
Okay.
So, how shall I summarise the plot for In the Earth? In the Earth, the latest film from Ben Wheatley, and Ben Wheatley basically conceived, wrote, and shot this film during the pandemic. So it all came about because of COVID, essentially. He was supposed to be directing a Tomb Raider movie, which he'll talk about in this interview in a bit, but then that all fell through because of COVID. And so because Ben Wheatley, I think, is a bit of a workaholic, he basically decided to write a horror film set in the world of COVID, and he went and shot it in the woods across 15 days with people he knew. So Joel Fry plays this character who he's like a scientific researcher, and he is sent to this forest, these woods, to go and do some research. We're not entirely clear what it is at the beginning. There's something that this is like, it's like a nature reserve inside these woods. You know, it's kind of quite untouched, isn't it? And because of that, it's quite treacherous. He's kind of warned that it's quite tough in terms of sort of battling against the elements in these woods. He's taken with a guide through the woods, and it's supposed to be like a 2-day hike to get to this specific place. And while journeying through these woods, things go wrong. And it turns into a very, very scary, nightmarish experience in the woods. So it's a weird film. What did you think of In the Earth?
That's putting it very mildly. It is an incredibly weird film. And do you know what? I was just so relieved that it wasn't full of jump scares. I really was, because, you know, that's my worst thing. And I also, films often lose me when there are jump scares in it, and they're not very clever. Whereas this, they do a really clever thing of getting you quite into the characters quite quickly, because there are so few. So you spend a lot of time with the same people.
Yeah.
Joel Fry is one of them, playing Martin. And Elora Torchia, who plays Alma, is the other. So yeah, these two are sort of with each other going through the woods. And you kind of think, okay, are they developing their relationship in some way? Is, you know, what's going on? And like really extreme things happen. And then they almost get like sort of not brushed off, but they just kind of have to keep going through them. We see some quite gruesome things quite quickly. And then suddenly it turns into like a different kind of genre altogether.
Yes.
Which was a huge shock, but it was really fun.
Yes. Do you know what it reminds me? I mean, it's not really like this film, but it reminds me a bit structurally of something like The Descent, where the first half of The Descent is so frightening purely because of the fact that these people are trapped in caves, and it's more about the sort of natural environment bringing the horror. Before then, there's some new additional horror right in the second half, and I guess this has a similar kind of trajectory in a way, because it's just as frightening, I think, when it's just people lost in the woods. That is a scary thing, I think.
They're not even lost.
No,
actually, they know where they're going, but just, yeah, you're right, just them being open to the elements, and also the fact that we don't really know. So it is obviously supposed to be COVID, this infection that's going around. But in your head, you know, we've seen so many films, you're like, well, is it a 28 days later kind of infection? Or is it the kind of pandemic that we've been going through? We don't know, actually. And we see him going through like the disinfectant stage. He has to give a sample of his urine. He has to have a swab up his nose, which is all painfully familiar. But again, there's something a little bit shifty about him.
And also, you don't know what this film is, because is this going to be, like you say, an infection movie? Is this going to be a horror film about the virus?
Which is 100% what I was expecting, actually.
That's how it's set up, because of this kind of quarantine situation. He's got, and this isn't a spoiler, this is all the first act, but Martin has got some sort of ringworm on his skin. There's a lot of stuff that is hinted at that makes you think, oh, this is going to be some hideous body horror infection movie, right? Yeah. Then as it goes on, you start to go, okay, is there something else? And then also there's this other element that's introduced in the opening act as well, which is this kind of folk horror element where there's this kind of old legend of this monster that lives in the woods, and there's this big kind of board, this almost sort of tapestry thing, tableau illustration of the woods.
It's very medieval, isn't it?
Yeah, this like ancient creature, that this like almost godlike creature, right, that lives in these woods, that this kind of and this legend has been built around it, and there's this whole thing with this stone and this hole in this stone, and there's a lot of imagery and references that call back to kind of folklore and that kind of thing. So again, you're going, okay, is this a supernatural story in some ways? There's also a lot of kind of real sort of heavy science stuff going on as well. So is it sort of science fiction? And the movie really kind of keeps you guessing, doesn't it? All the way till the very end. Yeah,
which I really liked. You know, I think it's a very smart thing to do. Yeah. When it would have been quite easy to have, you know, if you're trying to make something on a shoestring budget, for example, I mean, I don't know actually how shoestring this budget was, but if you're trying to make things happen really quickly, which obviously they did, they wrote and directed it, and, you know, wrote and filmed it and put it out all within a year. You sort of think, well, it would have been very easy to do almost like a sort of bottle episode of a film. Yeah. And they don't.
No, it's ambitious.
And Ben doesn't. He does so much with it, and he interweaves so many different threads and strands of different subgenres of horror. Like, you could cover this on so many of your
seasons,
which I really like that, because I think we it's very tempting to put like everything in boxes, and this doesn't fit into one neatly, which is great.
And one thing that Ben Wheatley tends to always get a bit
He gets funny about it.
He gets a bit funny about
Yeah, he
it.
does.
Is when people refer to this movie as a folk horror.
Yeah, he did. Overly.
It is a folk horror, and also he single-handedly is the guy that sort of made folk horror a thing. Again, he completely denies this. He says it's Mark Gatiss, and it's partly Mark Gatiss who made it a thing because he kind of coined that term in a BBC documentary. But at the same time, Ben Wheatley made Kill List, Sightseers, and A Field in England. There were these 3 horror films all set in the English countryside about weird English customs and...
He called it rural horror, right?
Rural horror, yeah. I mean, folk horror is such a weird term and you can apply it to lots of things. So yeah, if you want to... But I think when most people think of folk horror, they are thinking of movies like The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General and The Witch, exactly, which are rural set horror films, usually set in the woods, usually about old ways coming back to get us, I suppose. And so often that is about the natural world.
Yeah.
So I think this is a folk horror. And what's really lovely about it is something that Ben Wheatley hasn't done for a very long time. You know, Rebecca, Free Fire, High Rise, Colin Burstead, these films he's done in the interim have been very different and all quite... He really tries his hand at so many different things. And some of them have been amazing, some of them have been less amazing, but it's so great to see him come back to British horror.
Yeah, it is. And also Colin Burstead, I think, is a really good example of... That's my wine.
Oh, sorry.
Colin Burstead is a really nice example of how he manages to do something on a very small scale and achieve something that still feels quite ambitious and cool, which is what he does here. So he's kind of got form, not necessarily, you know, he's got a form of doing something like this.
Do you think that another thing that Ben Wheatley became quite famous for in his early career with movies like Kill List is this, and Colin Burstead as well, is this feeling of almost improvised Mike Leigh-esque performances where he would sort of script it, but he would let them sort of do it off script and then they'd do it on script and this kind of thing. Did you get that at all with this, or is this something different? I mean, do you feel like these performances were those kind of naturalistic, unscripted kinds, or not?
Do you know what? I kept flip-flopping all the way through the film. I kept flip-flopping about that because sometimes it felt really staccato and it felt quite performative. And then you realise that's because there are certain characters who are performing. You know, they're pretending to be one thing and are actually something else, and that's why it feels a bit performative. And then you have actually the character of Martin does feel incredibly natural in his reactions to everything, and his just like his breathing I thought was really clever because he kind of reacts in that fear, the way that we would react if these horrific things are happening to us. It doesn't, I suppose they don't go to extremes with their reactions, which I really liked. It's not a film full of like screaming.
No.
Something like the Blair Witch Project. In my head, it's just like a lot of like panting and screaming.
Yeah. I mean, it is. Yeah.
And in this, it kind of got similar vibes about it. But it's not handheld, thank God, for the majority of it. But so I think Martin's character was really natural, and the two characters of Martin and Alma, the way that they are, and then you have Hayley Squires and Rishi Smith both feel more deliberate.
Yes. Completely agree with you. Yeah. These two pairs of performances, and we'll talk maybe more about their characters in spoilers.
The spoiler bit, sure.
But yeah, you're totally right. I feel like when those two characters are introduced, that is when it starts to shift, and their performances are much bigger in a way, or more character than the other two. Yeah.
Those are they're very specific to this film, whereas I guess that Martin and Alma, you could kind of pick them up and put them in any other film because they are just humans reacting to other stuff.
Yes.
Yep. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you do not like jumpy movies. We've talked a lot on this podcast. And actually, it's funny. Somebody actually asked me recently, a listener said, does Rhianna actually like horror films or does she not? Because do you make her watch things that she doesn't want to watch?
Yes.
I was like, no.
All the fucking time.
But actually, you do like horror films. But I was trying to sort of think in my head with... What it is about certain horror films you really hate and take against, and what you don't hate.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, I'm assuming here of you, so tell me if I'm wrong. But I think you don't like movies that are purely set out to scare you, and that's all they do.
Yeah.
So movies like Conjuring movies that you basically go and sit down to watch them just to jump every 5 minutes,
I don't
right?
like that.
As opposed to movies that are
Well, A Quiet
doing
Place
something different.
2 is or A Quiet Place franchise is an interesting one because
yeah, that's super jumpy.
it's really jumpy, but also there is so much heart there.
Yes,
And
it's more Spielbergy almost.
It is.
Yeah.
It's quite schmaltzy as well.
Yeah.
And can kind of get on board with that, actually. So, yeah, because even I was thinking about this myself.
Because
Because
when-
you were so wary of me seeing this. When you first saw it, you were like, you will hate this film. And I was like, oh, great. Can't wait to see you do this Q&A later. And then I watched it and it was partly, it was so important that I saw it in a cinema because if I'd watched it on my laptop or if we watched it even on, maybe got away with it on TV, but definitely on a laptop if you're watching it on streaming.
Oh, you'd
it would have been-
lose
it would have
so
been
much.
absolutely dreadful. I really wouldn't have enjoyed it nearly half as much because you lose a lot of the subtleties, but also the immersive. I mean, you can use this argument for any film, the immersiveness, etc. But because it's the sound design is so important in this. I think if you're watching it on like a sort of tinny
Yes.
laptop, it would be horrendous.
Yeah.
And you just want to shut it.
Yeah.
So yeah, what I liked about this is that it wasn't really frightening, but it had really grotesque moments in it, but I really enjoyed it. It felt really like, I think because I was watching with an audience as well who was so engaged and they were like, I was one of the loudest people laughing in that cinema because it felt so cathartic to kind of almost like shriek and genuinely like do little cries of horror and go no out loud with everyone else and then laugh in relief because you've just done it. It was a really lovely thing to do, and I think it made the experience of the film better, and also it was just it hit all the right notes. The film.
Yeah.
It didn't go too overboard with at points it did. But there's like one moment where you're watching a particularly horrible bit of body horror and I was like, I can watch this.
Yeah.
I could watch it.
I think it's also a tonal thing because when Ben Wheatley made Kill List, he talked about how everything in Kill List is supposed to feel terrifying. Everything is like a nightmare. It's like there's no laughs, there's no release, there's no catharsis. It's a scary film. And then on the flip side, he followed that up with Sightseers, which is kind of similar in some ways in terms of the level of gore and stuff. But everything, he said, rather than everything working towards making you scared, everything is working towards a joke. Everything is designed to make you laugh. This is sort of somewhere in between, isn't he? He's sort of balancing the two because it is scary, but it is also really funny. Because I think you laugh at how uncomfortable and excruciating it gets at times with that body horror and other things. You know?
And also that they do it quite. They are quite funny when they do it. Like Joel Fry, in my head, is a comedic actor. I've only ever seen him in comedies, or playing comedic characters. Like so, he's in Yesterday, and he plays a sort of buffoonish side friend. He's in Cruella, and he plays one of the two. Horace and whatever the other one's, Jasper, the kind of goons. Although they give him a much, he's a much lovelier character in that. But he's still a slightly buffoonish character. And several other things. And so the fact that he was cast in this already, you're kind of thinking, oh, okay, so it's not like a hugely dramatic role necessarily because you've cast someone who is more well known for comedy.
Yeah.
And he does manage to hit all the comedic notes as well as all the tragic ones.
Yeah, he does an amazing job. And yeah, you're right. I think he does bring a sort of natural comedy to some of the more excruciating moments. And of course, so does Rishi Smith, who you've only ever seen really, in very dark, this is perfect for him because it is just really dark comedy. Yeah. Basically.
And he's having so much fun with it.
Oh, yeah.
But also, I don't know, we've watched him in every single episode of Inside Number 9, for example. And it just does feel like an extension of an Inside Number 9, his character. Yeah. You could 100% have that.
Oh, totally.
Have this made into a short 30-minute and it be some sort of Inside Number 9.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true.
Inside the Number 9 tent or something.
Yeah.
Because it's all 100%. Outside.
Yeah, I agree. Feels like something Rishi Smith himself could have written.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Which again is really clever because Ben Wheatley is knows the strengths of his performers and is playing to them and is working. You don't often see scripts that kind of worked around, actors are obviously supposed to bend to the film that they're in, but this does a really great job of kind of having its cake and eating it as well in that regard.
How do you feel about the COVID connection to it? Because a lot of people have said, oh, I'm not ready to start watching films about COVID virus, right? How do you feel about this? Like, how did you feel about it going into it being like, oh, this is going to be a movie about COVID, potentially?
Do you know what? I didn't know how necessary it was, having seen the film, that it had to be about a pandemic. Because it's so about the woods. Yeah. And it could have just been about research within the woods.
It could have been, yeah.
And it didn't need that sort of, added bit of them talking. They never mentioned COVID, but they talk about the pandemic, it talks about the third wave. They talk about lockdown. Yeah. People their relatives have died in cities where it was obviously much worse.
Yeah, it's very obviously about COVID, even though they never actually mentioned the word COVID in the script. Yeah.
But yeah, it is very obviously about it, and it's not hugely necessary, but I also don't think it detracts from it. Yeah. I don't think you go into it going, oh God, I need some escapism, because it is escapism. Totally. Yeah. You lose that sense of it being in any way infection related. Yeah. Yeah. As soon as you're 20 minutes in. Yeah. And they start going on this hike through the woods. That's it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I guess it just fits with the general themes of the film about biological horrors, isn't it? Kind of gross stuff that I get really squeamish about. Yeah. Microbes and germs and
you are really squeamish about that.
That kind of thing.
There aren't any insects in this.
Ooh, yeah, but I just kept thinking about the insects. Horrible. So there you go. We should get into the spoilers before we talk about any more. But I do think we should finish by just saying how important it is. I haven't really said, I suppose, but I love this film. This is like my favourite film I've seen this year. And I think that's partly because, like you said at the beginning, this was the first film I saw on the big screen and it was really special. Yeah. But I love Ben Wheatley when he does horror. I think he's really good at horror. And that the kind of weird horror that I love. And like you said, this is something that could fit in so many different seasons of this podcast. And another thing that I love about it in a very nerdy way is that it almost kind of takes you through stage by stage different sort of subgenres of horror in a way. Yeah. And I could talk about that more specifically in spoilers, but it really does kind of shift and evolve and change. And I think if you're a horror nerd, there are so many different references and things that you can spot along the way.
Oh, 100%. And all of them went over my head.
Yeah, which is fine. But that's a good...
You don't need it.
That's a good sign to know that you still enjoyed it despite that. Yeah,
because at this Q&A, like all these incredible fans of Ben Wheatley in the audience are just like, and Ben Wheatley himself and you were referencing all of these really obscure films, and I could see like your face lighting up with each one because you were like, yeah. I was like, I have no idea what the fuck any of these films are. What are they all talking about?
A lot of obscure stuff from the 70s, basically. Yeah. So there you go. So overall, then, you would recommend people go to the cinema to see In the Earth?
You have to go to the cinema.
I mean, you can't not, actually. It's not available for streaming, but you would recommend...
But do it, yeah. Don't wait for it to come on. Don't wait. I mean, I think if you are a Ben Wheatley fan and you are a horror fan and you feel comfortable going to the cinema, there's no reason why you wouldn't go and see this. No. There really isn't, because it's incredibly special and cool. I mean, there is intense strobing.
There is intense strobing.
Really intense strobing.
And intense sound design and score. Yes.
Glenn Mansell did the score. Yeah. We haven't even talked about that.
Incredible score.
Oh my God, it was so cool. I love Clint Mansell. He's a genius when it comes to music. And this is just like this... The way the sound design and the score work together in this film, it's almost like they almost should be working against each other because the sound design is so jarring at points. But it is sort of interwoven really, really cleverly. And yeah, the strobing though is a lot.
But that's the thing, it's all a feast for the senses. And I think you kind of need to see it on a big screen for that reason, you know? And I don't always say that. I'm not one of those people that says about every film, because I don't believe that about every film, that it's, you have to see it on a big screen, otherwise you lose something. There's a lot of horror films, in fact, that I think are even better to watch on your own at home on streaming platforms or on DVD. But this is not one of them. Like, this is 100% go see it with other people, go see it in a big screen with really loud volume, and just be engrossed and terrified for an hour and a half. So before we get into spoilers, let's hear my conversation with the director, Ben Wheatley. I got to sit down and chat to him about the making of the film. Spoiler-free, this interview, for a 10-15 minutes or so. So here is my discussion with Ben Wheatley. Welcome to the podcast, Ben Wheatley. How you doing, Ben?
I'm good, man. How you doing?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Really good. Congratulations, first of all, on In the Earth. Absolutely loved the movie. So tell us a little bit about the kind of, I suppose, quite unique circumstances, right, as to how this film happened.
Yeah, I mean, it basically, I started writing it at the beginning of the lockdown. And we managed to get it made in the middle of 2020 at the lowest point of the first wave, which was all quite bizarre. Basically what happened is I was watching a lot of stuff on VOD and I realized that everything felt really anachronistic and weird and like from another time, you know. And if I was going to make anything, it would have to be about the moment that we were in. And there's this weird thing in the media of like denying the fact that we've had, this has all happened to us. But it was it was even more intense, obviously intense at the beginning, and it kind of goes up and down. But I wanted to, and it kind of tied in back to the other movies I'd made, like the Colin Burstead or to Kill List, in a way that they are movies that come out of the period of history that we were in, you know, so they're specific to the time or like taken from the headlines kind of thing to a degree. So I sat down and wrote it, and we and it just came together really quickly. You know, we figured that there'd be a moment just after the first wave had finished, that there would be a chance before all the big production started again, that we could get in there and make something. And it was all a bit seat of the pants, but it all came off, and we kept it kind of secret from everyone because we didn't want to get into halfway through the production and then have some kind of COVID outbreak and it all just be a disaster. So we thought we'd just make the film, get it done, and then we can tell everyone that we've done it.
It's very, very cool. And actually, I mean, you mentioned Colin Burstead, right? I mean, I remember that was a sort of follow-up to Free Fire, quite a big movie, right, with big movie stars and everything. And similarly, this, you know, comes after Rebecca. It seems like you seem to you follow up your big studio films with kind of smaller pictures that are more like your early stuff. Is that kind of a deliberate choice? Are you doing something like that kind of almost like a little bit of a palate cleanser after these big projects?
The first one that was like that was Field in England, which came after Sightseers, and Sightseers was meant to go on to a film that we were developing called Freak Shift, which was a big sci-fi thing, and it didn't happen. And it kind of been like we'd spent a year on it, and then the financing didn't come together, and we kind of went, oh, you know, we could then go and try and do another big movie like that, or just make a film. And so I decided to make Field in England, you know, and that came together really quick. And that's generally why they happen. They're not like palette cleaners per se. It's not as planned as that. It's much more like, you know. So I went into COVID, and basically I was meant to go Rebecca, then Tomb Raider 2, but as we hit COVID, Tomb Raider 2 kind of disappeared into the long grass, and then this opportunity kind of opened up, and we went, all right, well, there's a chance to make a movie here before everything's settled, it becomes reset. So that's basically what it was. And I like making low budget stuff. I really enjoy it. So it is good fun.
I always kind of think in my head of Kill List, Sightseers, and A Field in England almost as like a little trilogy in a way, kind of these kind of the dangers of the British countryside kind of movies in a way. And it really feels like this was a kind of continuation of a lot of those themes. Again, was that something that you were kind of keen to revisit from some of your early movies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd been... So making Kill List, we'd made that in a vacuum really, and not really thought about kind of where it sits or what British horror is or any of those things. And then in the subsequent years, it started with that Mark Gatiss horror documentary, and then them starting to talk about folk horror. And I'm like, oh, folk horror, what is that? You know, is that a thing? And then by now, here we are in 2021, and it's like, there's all sorts of stuff about folk
everywhere.
horror.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. And I was kind of thinking, well, what do I think about it? Having made a film which has been put into that canon, but then didn't even know that it was a thing, in the start. And the same with Field in England. I think it was only those two movies together. They weren't really thinking about those. That there was a context for those films at all. And so you have those elements within this, which is like talking about the idea of what folk horror might be, but then In the Earth is almost like a travelogue through British horror for me, so it kind of goes, and horror in general. So it kind of it ends up in a kind of a Quatermass kind of Doctor Who 1970s kind of science fiction world by the end of it, but it gets there via body horror stuff and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Hansel and Gretel and all these different kind of influences.
Yeah, it's so true, actually. And folk horror is such a strange sort of amorphous term, isn't it? We talked about it a lot on this podcast, and there's been a lot of documentaries. And it's kind of like, what is folk horror? How do you define folk horror, I suppose? And, even movies like Texas Chainsaw, in some way, you can kind of link to folk horror.
I think all horror is folk horror. I mean, when you get down to it, I mean, Dracula, all the big monsters are all folk horror monsters, aren't they, effectively? So, it's a bit of an amorphous blob of a of a thing. But I think it's a specific thing about, the horrors of Britain, or like Civil War horror, or those kinds of things that you can start to make them into a little subset. But as soon as it gets outside of that, it races off all over the place, and kind of you're soon putting a circle around everything.
We're always looking on this podcast at kind of that sort of social and historical sort of context to these waves of movies that come about, whether it was those kind of nastier movies in the wake of Vietnam in the 70s, or sort of similar sort of thing maybe in the 2000s with the sort of torture movies and that kind of thing. Do you think there's a reason, or is it just the cyclical nature of horror, as to why these kind of folk horror, these kind of back to the woods, I suppose, kind of movies have become so rife and popular again in this last decade?
I don't know. I mean, from my position, I can't even talk for myself. And like from my position, Kill List was made up of nightmares that I'd had. So I wrote them down, and I thought I'll make, if I'm making a horror film, I make out of things that I'm scared of. So it was as simple as that. There wasn't any kind of, it wasn't looking at The Wicker Man or looking at other horror movies. It was just thinking, oh, these things are scary. And we got asked a lot about Wicker Man for Kill List, and my answer was always, if I'd nicked it from anywhere, it was Parallax View.
Right, yeah.
That was the film. That was a much bigger influence on me than Wicker Man ever was. But obviously, these things are all kind of intertwined, and you do it subconsciously. And then Field in England was something that had come from being involved with the Sealed Knot and battle reenactment, and being interested in the Civil War, and that was it. And basically that script had been written over 10 years and changed around and all sorts of stuff. So again, it wasn't to do with cinema itself. It hadn't come from an idea of going, Witchfinder General or anything like that. It was very specifically from experience. So I don't know where other people kind of come up with their ideas. It's but I tend not to. I think I tend not to look at cinema as much as I can. But then that's the contradiction of what I've just said, obviously. But it's kind of I start with things I think that would scare the crap out of me in the cinema, and then I will kind of generally try and work backwards from that.
Clearly, right, the woods, is that a sort of place that really scares you? I mean, again, it's this recurring theme in a lot of your horror movies. Yeah,
it's primal, isn't it? It's like it will kill you.
Yeah. So
that's it. And it makes you think when you're in it. That's the basic version of yourself, is like you've stripped of everything and you're in the woods trying to find shelter, and then something wants to eat you, or not even eat you, you just you twist your ankle and starve to death or something, or you get lockjaw, or there's so many ways it can do you in, so I think that's what I'm afraid of. And I lived in Essex when I was a kid and spent a lot of time playing in woods, and I think that's imprinted into my head, that kind of, like, it's uncaring, you know. It's like when you fall off a tree and you hit the branches on the way down, it just doesn't care what happens to you, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's unforgiving, isn't it? And I think that this movie, In the Earth, really kind of introduces that. Even before some of the real horrors and peril comes about, there is that danger of just the woods, right? The great outdoors, like you say, bugs or hurting yourself, stepping on something, whatever it might be. What was it like to shoot? I mean, like 15 days, right? And it's like all outdoors in the woods. What was that shoot like, particularly during COVID?
Well, the 15 daysness of it is that we'd found the shooting schedule for Halloween, the original Carpenter Halloween, and it's not much. I think it's like that might be 19 days or something.
Yeah,
and it was a similar budget to what we had, you know, in adjusted for inflation. So, I think that's good. That's the right amount of time to make a horror film. You know, around that. If you can't make a good horror film in that time, you're doing something wrong. You know, and the COVIDness of it, I was worried that a little bit about that, because maybe it was going to make us less flexible and be able to shoot as fast, but it turned out it didn't make any difference. Mm-hmm. The only difference was that we had to wear masks, and there was COVID kind of people on the set making sure we washed our hands and stuff. But I mean, it was really minimal. I mean, on a kind of personal level, it meant that people that I hadn't worked with before, I couldn't recognize them, because all I'd ever see them of them was their eyes. So I'd run into that people in the bar in the hotel, and they go, like, look at me like they knew me. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. You know, have to go like that and cover their faces. But that side of it was the only thing I felt that was bad. And there's many good things that came out of it. I felt like the kind of using Zoom for all the production meetings was brilliant. You know, as everything was much quicker, and the way that the food was served is like you put your order in the beginning of the day, and then it just turns up in a box and you eat it. So there's no going and queuing up and all that nonsense. So there's lots of good stuff that came out of it, I felt, you know.
You mentioned this briefly already about sort of the way in which it kind of references horror, sort of different horror sort of subgenres and films. I found that really fascinating. It kind of, like you said, there's an element of kind of Nigel Neal in there, I think, and John Carpenter, right? That's what I saw. But also quite bizarre sort of British 70s stuff like Children of the Stone or The Owl Service and things like that, right? Were these sort of things all sort of consciously sort of in your head when you were making it?
Yeah, I mean, I came to Children of the Stone and Owl Service quite late. I didn't see them. I'm a bit too young to have seen them on television at the time, you know.
Yeah.
But I saw them in my 30s, I guess. And I just was blown away by it. Certainly, well, both of them really. But Children of the Stone was like a David Lynch miniseries. It's just bizarre, and like
and it's for kids, right? As well, it's like
it was out. It was on at like 4:00 or something.
Yeah,
4:30. And it's bonkers, you know. And if they put that on telly now for adults, it would be too hard for the modern audience to understand. So I love that, you know. So yeah, there were little shout outs to those things within the movie, but it's and Children of the Stones is absolutely terrific, you know. Again, really complicated. I don't, you know, it's like much more complicated than modern stuff is.
It is. You created this whole sort of you've created a kind of folklore in the backdrop of this too, right? This kind of monster and the designs, the artwork, and all of this kind of thing. Again, was that kind of drawing on anything, or is that all come completely from your head?
Yeah, it's made up, you know, like it all is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
It's totally made up. I mean, you know, and we were really careful with, even in Kill List, to make it up and not sit on top of other actual religions or belief systems as much as we could, you know, because it's our thing. It's like you know, and that's what makes it scary, because it's, you know, there's thought behind it, but you don't know whose thought it is, rather than kind of, you know, the usual suspects of pointing fingers at pagans and going, oh, it's them, they're the other, you know, it's demonize them, you know. Even saying demonize is complicated. But it's, you know, I wanted that thing of that there's layers of the idea of what the folk stuff would be in the film, which is like, is it, because folk itself, you know, some of those traditions aren't that old. You know, they come from Victorian or a little bit earlier than that. Some of them are really old, some of them aren't, but they're all mixed up to us in this kind of like history brew that gets served up. And some of it is 70s stuff, you know, that's just been repackaged back And that's the thing of like that picture. It's like, where's the picture come from at the beginning? Or it's not even that old, or is it? You wouldn't get a woodcut that was that big. It's too big.
So true. It's
not
true.
Right. It's just not, and like, and the kind of Zach's understanding of the Parnag Feg character is like, is he even made all that up? It's not, So I think it's, that's what I was kind of playing with, of like, it's kind of it's more about narrative, and like the idea of like the dangers of narrative than it is necessarily about a specific narrative which is actually true.
I remember when you made Kill List and you said, like you've already said actually, about how everything in Kill List is designed to make you feel uncomfortable, to feel frightened. Were you going for a similar tone here? Because I think there's a really interesting tonal balance with this. I mean, particularly with casting people like Reece Shearsmith, who's so good at balancing comedy and horror, right? And when I saw it, I was laughing as much as I was terrified. And again, was that something you were going for, that sort of tonal balance, I suppose?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Reece in himself is iconic. So he recalls all his characters when you see him to a degree. Yeah. And he recalls the characters from his character Whitehead from Field in England. That was important, but also his performance is completely unique to this film. From him, he's very different than anything I've seen him in. Really, the way he played it. So and then that horror and comedy are always hand in hand to a degree. And I think I've made Kill List becomes kind of alienating to some members of the audience after a while because it's so horrible, and I wasn't sure that was the right way to go. You either go both boots in and make something really that's relentlessly punishing to the audience, or you kind of temper it a little bit. And I think I'd seen Kill List with enough groups of people to know that it was kind of that if you go too heavy in, or you show something too extreme, it drops people out of the film for a while, and then they have to come back who aren't, So I think that kind of meanness is a bit more tempered in this film than Kill List to a degree,
Yeah. Did you worry about alienating people with this one as well? Because the last act, particularly, without spoiling anything, it gets mental, right? It gets bonkers. And were you thinking, how are people going to react to this? It even feels like a bit of a sensory attack with the strobing and with the sound design and everything, right?
Yeah, I don't think I worried about it because the film is what it is. It exists in that it is a kind of midnight movie. So it's you would hope that people would come to it with that feeling. But also I wanted to kind of push the boundaries on that of that experiential cinema, so that you felt like you something had happened to you, rather than that kind of just it broadcasts out of the screen and you process it and you think about it. It's more like the screen is grabbing you and pulling you, and certainly with the sound as well. Yeah. And that's the cinema experience, hopefully, that we'll start to see when, this one opens finally, and we get to see that people aren't just watching it on screens.
I know, incredible. Actually, I was lucky enough to see it on a big screen, and it was one of my first big screen experiences, back since the world's returned to normal, and it was absolutely incredible. It must be a real relief to know that people are going to be watching it in cinemas here.
Yeah, totally. We're in a really weird situation where, like, most of the reviews of the film have been done from laptops,
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, you can see there is a difference. It is a different thing. And like you have to be philosophical about it, but we felt a little bit robbed at Sundance because it was shown like that. But then the film wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for COVID. So then it's like a bit of catch-22. So, I really would have loved to have seen it like a midnight screening. There would have been something, I think,
Would have been incredible. You've got some brilliantly gruesome body horror in this movie as well. And actually a really good friend of mine and friend of this podcast, Dan Martin, I know you work with quite a lot, right? How is it kind of, again, in that environment, working with prosthetics and everything? Because that's quite a process, right? On film sets and that kind of thing.
It's the horror for the assistant director when they see prosthetics come up on the schedule. They're like, slightly terrified because it's like basically a time thief which is going to just destroy the day. But Dan is very quick, and we also discussed it a lot about how we could get around it without causing problems. And a lot of it is about just asking the right questions. So it's like you talk to Dan and go, all right, so how long does this foot prosthetic take to put on? It's like, all right, it's an hour and a half, right? So then if you take the actor out to put that on, then that's an hour and a half in your schedule. And when you've only got like 4 actors, you can't shoot anything else. So you're kind of screwed. But then we came up with, why don't we just get a double and then put that on the double? And then you can just, as long as you shoot at a certain angle, you can then just blast through that scene. There's no hour and a half lost. It's done, and that's what we did. So it's thinking like that around it, so that you pay out a little bit more for another body there, but then that allows you to move a lot faster.
So good. It's brilliantly gross. I loved it.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed doing the prosthetics. I hadn't done it for a while, and I was like, oh man, this is good fun. It's like old school filmmaking.
So good. I just want to wrap up with a couple of listener questions that have tweeted in. At Zombie Slew asks, what's the best thing about having a low budget film and the worst thing about doing a big budget film?
The best thing about doing a low budget film is that you're much more likely to get it made.
Yeah.
It's much more likely to make money. So those two things are great. The worst thing about making a big budget movie is that it's such a massive beast. It just takes a long time. It's quite slow to move, in comparison. So you've got so many people involved in everything that there's so many lines of communication that you have to be on top of. And that becomes weirdly more complicated in a way, and much harder to do than a small budget film. But then obviously the advantages are all of a sudden you're not having to, people aren't leafing through your script and going, oh, this scene is set in a pub with people in the background. You can't do that, in a big budget movie. It's like, whoa, how many 100 people do you want? So that's the good stuff.
And Tracy Thompson has asked, what's your favourite film you've directed? Let's not count In the Earth for this, but is there one that you're particularly you look back at that you're proudest of?
I mean, I can't say, because the others will become jealous.
Yeah.
But I think that there's two really, I guess, which is that Down Terrace was the one where we went from all of people involved went from not being filmmakers to being filmmakers it almost instantaneously, and that was kind of absolutely insane, and that taught us a lot. And then the other one would be A Field in England, which I've always think is it was a really beautiful script from Amy, and we had a really good laugh making it.
And final question from @RoscoeG, what happened in Kiev?
You know what? I don't know. They never told me.
Ben Wheatley, thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers, man.
A big thank you to the incredible Ben Wheatley. Okay, from this point onwards, I am going to say spoiler alert. The following conversations you're about to hear with both Rhianna Dhillon and Dan Martin will be spoilerific, okay? So please go check out the film. It's very rainy this week, perfect weather to go visit your local cinema and see this incredible film on the big screen. Then come back and listen to the rest of this discussion. You have been warned.
You worried she's going to get you?
Yeah, who is it?
It's a local folk tale. She's the spirit of the woods. Wake up. Something's there. Listen. Someone's watching us.
Okay, we will get into spoilers now. So I want to ask you, the thing that I wanted to ask you about was, what I thought...
You're so gleeful that you got me to see this film,
I know, because I
you?
really thought you were going to hate the final act of this film when it does go mushrooms,
It's my least favourite.
Yeah, you hate drug trips, and the whole last act of this film is like just batshit bonkersness, right?
Yeah.
Strobing, jarring sound design, mushrooms, hallucinations all over the place. But you didn't mind it.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it was my least favourite bit. And I think because it had done such a great job with the first two acts, that I was willing to let it slide a bit more.
Yeah.
And because it had already sort of won me over by that point. Visually, there are some really cool bits with the mushrooms. So you see in the kind of misty woods, while everyone else is sleeping, mushrooms start to like burst open and their spores puff out into the atmosphere, and does look really cool. It's a really awesome image.
Yeah.
But yeah, then they kind of are trapped in this little camp, and they're not able to go anywhere because of the
wall of mushroom.
the wall of mushroom spores in the air.
So cool. I love that. It's such a good, like you say, such a good visual.
Yeah, visually it's amazing. But then when they actually go into hallucinating, and at first I was like, oh yeah, this is cool, and then it just goes on a little bit too long.
Yeah, it's horrible though.
It is,
and it does go on. Yeah,
yeah, and you kind of get the idea of like your I don't know what you felt, but for me it was like your eyeballs exploding and like blood vessels exploding, a lot of exploding things like body, and it's not actually that. It's almost like dye going into water, being dropped into water or something.
Yeah.
But just what that evokes,
yes,
I suppose, is quite cool and quite clever. And I like the way that it flashes back to other points in the film. And but yeah, it did hallucinating and drugs. I just find that really boring to watch.
Yeah, I get that. I've
seen it so many times. It's in
often
so
just
many
an
films.
excuse for filmmakers to just go a bit weird.
Go arty. It's like that bit in 2001.
Yeah.
Not drug induced, but space induced. But
Yeah. Yeah.
It went on a long time.
It does go on a long time. The Stargate sequence, you mean? Yeah, that does go on a long time. I totally get what you mean. Like when it just loses all sense of everything and you're just seeing shapes and colours for God knows how long.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not ideal. This, for whatever reason, it did not bother me. I was so engrossed in this.
Sure, yeah.
And I think because I was so invested by this point in the threat and in what was going to happen to these characters that when they went through that wall, I was genuinely like, worried for them and scared, as to what was going to happen next, kind of thing. So let me ask you about Rishi Smith's character, because what I love, there's this initial kind of first act where it is just like two people in the woods, and there's some horrible stuff initially, like where something happens to them, they're attacked, right?
Yeah.
And they wake up, then they're sort of bleeding, they've lost their shoes, they've been knocked out, and from that point you're like, oh god, this is horrible already. I was on edge from this point onwards.
At every point I was just like, one of them's gonna die.
Yeah, and then what, the other one's gonna be by themselves.
Yes, which would be the worst thing.
Yeah.
At every point I was worried about that.
Yeah.
And then that never happened, thank God. But the threat was always hanging.
Is real.
Yeah, it was very real. And that and again the strobing when they're in the tent and you have no idea what's happening at that moment. I'm still not 100% sure what that was.
No, was Rishi Smith just like whacking them, like hitting them with
but also
something?
with a flashlight? Like what was, I don't know.
The strobing was the actual the strobe light, the strobe lights that they have up in the woods.
But I thought they weren't at that point in the woods where they were.
I'm not entirely sure either. I need to revisit it, because that's the thing, and this is what I loved about it, but I don't completely understand everything that I saw yet.
And that's okay, actually. I quite like that. But so after they're attacked, and he treads on fucking bit of something. Okay, do you know what really did annoy me and what did distract me for quite a long time was after they'd been attacked and their shoes were stolen, they still had like material, like their tents were still there. Okay, yeah, they were ripped up, but there was still stuff around them, and they abandoned everything and left barefoot. And I was like, just wrap some material around your feet.
Oh, that's a good point.
You're in the woods.
You could make some socks.
Of course you could. That was the first thing that I thought of. Like, no way would you go tramping around the woods in bare feet. Oh, no, you are. Even though you had loads of stuff still left in your sad little camp.
Oh, that's a really good point. I didn't even think about that.
It bothered me for like a good half an hour.
I was genuinely like, oh, you're fucked. What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
This is why we work very well as a couple, because I always have the very logical response to things. It's like, oh, what about this? I'm like, well,
I get completely swept up in any story I'm told. I'm like, oh my God, there is no hope. I'm always surprised by twists. I never see anything coming. I never overthink
That's not true.
But yeah, that is a really horrible thing. A very simple thing, but how horrible just to take away their shoes and socks.
Well, it's like in Die Hard.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the glass
that kind
scenario
of pain
in
that
Die
you
Hard.
feel. You just feel it, don't you? It's so horrible.
And then when you see it, and again, the way that they do Rishi Smith, he's so funny.
Yeah.
But when he's like, and they're all like, oh, that's nasty. And it's really comical. Yeah. And then you see it and it's fucking horrible. And the way that he sews it up is just, it's the most.
Oh God!
This poor guy.
And Joel Fry Martin is so polite. He's so British about it.
So
he doesn't want to kick up a fuss, and he's like, he's not, saying don't fucking come near me with that old needle and thread.
Oh my God. It's
He's
not
like,
even a thread,
okay.
it's like animal guts.
Yeah, everything about it is so horrible. And even when he goes to chop off his toes, Martin is kind of like, okay, doesn't really kind of.
He's like, no, please
put up
don't.
Much of
Please
a fight.
don't. Please don't.
Yeah.
He's not just like, get the fuck away from me, you psycho.
Yeah. It's and that kind of makes it funnier and also even more uncomfortable
tragic.
at the same time.
Yeah.
So Reece Shearsmith, what a great role, because
really fun.
He starts off, he's obviously weird from the get-go, but you start off thinking he might just be a kind of harmless hippie type, right? He's very kind of like Earth Child, and
come back and see my camp.
one of those annoying people that would sit with a classical guitar.
Oh my God, that was so funny.
Yeah.
So like, they're in the middle of this thing, and this poor guy's got his flap of skin hanging open. He's just been sewn up, and then Reece Shearsmith's character offers them a bit of his homemade brew of like elderflower.
That's so good, and they're both like, and then they both.
You're just like, oh, are you drinking? Or you're drinking something that the stranger's just given you. Oh God. And then he sits down with his guitar and everyone just collapsed because it is like that wanker that comes around like a camp, takes his acoustic guitar to any tent camp scenario.
It's so good. It's
hilarious.
Reece Shearsmith is excellent. And then just the way in which he becomes more and more sinister. And this is a horrible... And this almost verges into a sort of torture porn type film at this point, where I don't suppose you've ever seen the film Wolf Creek, have you?
What do you think?
No, probably not. It's a really horrible film.
Yes, that's why I've never seen it.
It's in some ways kind of similar to
Isn't
this.
it a true story?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why.
About some backpackers in Australia. They meet a guy. He seems very nice, in the middle of nowhere. He gives them some drink. They all sit around the campfire. Then turns out they're drugged. Then they wake up, and then the rest of the film is horrendous stuff happening to them. And this kind of starts to go in that direction, and you're like, oh fuck, this is what this film is. When they start to realize that they're drugged, they start to sort of pass out, then they're tied up, then there's the cutting off of the toes and having to escape him, and suddenly you're like, oh my God, this is going to be what we're watching now for the rest of the film, like them trying to escape this mad axe murderer in the woods.
And that did go on a long time, but
that's the whole second act of the film, is that, isn't it? And that is probably, and I think I've read a lot of people say that is where the film peaks. Like that's the film at its best and most exciting is the whole Reece Shearsmith section before you then get to Hayley Squires.
Yeah, I think also because you have these in folk horror, very often you see those tableaus, those scenes that you talked about, where people are, but like dead people are put in these weird, grotesque positions with stones on their eyes or whatever, and so the fact that he was doing this with live people, it was that double-edged thing where you were like relieved that they were still alive, but also you were like, there's no hope, there's no escape, because we know how this will end,
and we know we've been told all the way up until this point just how dangerous these woods are, just how far they are from anyone or anything, how hard it is to get back from there and everything, and you really feel like, oh, they're fucked.
Yes, and they are.
They are.
But yeah, so I think those photos that he takes and the positions that he puts them in and all of that kind of ritualistic stuff makes it absolutely fascinating, and makes it, because you constantly have that bit of hope.
Yes.
I think that's that push and pull, the fact that you don't totally give up on them is quite cool. Because as soon as you know someone's going to die, and as soon as they say, we're going to die, aren't we? I was like, ooh, they might not.
Yeah. Did you ever believe at any point through this that it was going to be a supernatural film? That Reece Shearsmith's character, Zach, sacrificing people to this god was actually going to be real, and that maybe we'd see some sort of tree god or whatever that creature is, Did you ever think that was a possibility whilst watching this?
I was almost hoping there would be.
Yeah. In some ways, that gives you a bit of an easier way out, I think. When that's the case, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And also, it would have just been quite cool to see how Ben Wheatley would have done that.
Yeah.
But also, I think the idea of just an absolute psychopath in the woods doing this without any actual reason is much more frightening than having a supernatural being that that would respond
Yes.
somehow.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting, and this brings us on to the Hayley Squires character, maybe, because then what happens is we go from this sort of very classic kind of monster in the woods type film, almost a bit like sort of Hicksploitation movies as well, kind of like Straw Dogs or Deliverance or something. It feels like those sorts of movies where nasty humans in the woods doing horrible things to each other, basically. Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well, obviously, which Ben Wheatley mentioned. It's got Texas Chainsaw in it. Then we go to science fiction suddenly. So then we're in Hayley Squires land, where we've got frequencies and monitors and speakers and strobe lights and all of this. And these two characters played by Reese and Hayley, who are like two different sides of the same coin, because they're kind of trying to get in touch with the same thing, right? They're sort of trying to get in touch with this god creature. Yeah. One is using faith and old ways of worship or whatever. The other is using sacrifice. The other is using science. And that's really interesting. And the way that the film then kind of shifts into science and science fiction in its final act with Hayley Squires' character is a really interesting thing. And it's, I guess it's kind of almost giving you like a little microcosm of the different ways in which people react to nature and the earth, right? That some people will look at things in the woods and think that's something divine that's created that. And other people will be like, well, that's science that's done this and this and this. And it's kind of the way humanity has always kind of reacted to the unknown shit in the woods, basically. The unknown. It was a bear. The unknown horrors of this world, essentially.
Yeah. Yes.
And I love that it kind of paints that picture in the middle of all this madness.
It is a kind of tableau in its own right.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Bayeux Tapestry, because you've got, it tells a whole story.
Yeah.
And you can see the evolution of what's happened and where these influences have come from. Hayley Squires' scientist character is still using a book from the 1600s.
Yes.
That's still the inspiration.
Yes, it's still ancient.
Yeah.
And even the equipment looks kind of analogy and sort of old as well.
Yeah, she's using like a keyboard.
This draws on the writer Nigel Neal, who did Quatermass, among other things, but he did a lot of British sci-fi of the 60s and 70s. And what he did was sort of cleverly merge sort of ghost stories with science fiction. So he made this play called The Stone Tape, which was about this idea of actually hearing frequencies from buildings, like that stone kind of carried frequencies based on their history, and that people could actually hear stuff, and it basically created ghosts, but it gave a scientific reason for ghosts.
Oh, cool.
And he did a lot of that kind of thing, basically sort of mixing supernatural with science and that kind of thing. And that's I think it almost exactly, and again, Ben Wheatley has named Nigel Neal and those sorts of TV plays from the 70s as inspiring this. But I think all of that is part of this really interesting sort of sci-fi mix with the occult and the supernatural.
Yeah. Also, I think Doctor Who is...
Well, Doctor Who was...
Delia Derbyshire, and her sound for Doctor Who was really what came to the forefront of my mind when I was watching this, because she used those sorts of frequencies, and she was a really interesting, strange woman who like lived in the bowels of the BBC, making all these incredible noises and using like synth, and it's so synthy, this film.
Oh, it's so good.
And so like 100%. And by the way, there's a really good documentary on the BBC about Delia Derbyshire.
Yeah,
so
I can't wait to see it.
If you love the sound design of In the Earth, then really do go and check it out. It's called the Delia Derbyshire Tapes.
Yeah, I really want to watch it, because I love that kind of thing, especially learning about music and sound and that kind of thing.
And just seeing like the way that Hayley Squires is like turning all these knobs to create all of these different sounds and everything.
It's so tactile. I love it.
It's so tactile. Yeah, it's very cool. And yeah, like I said, and like you were saying, it's not like it's extremely modern.
No,
it is an old school
kind of
way
70s.
Of working. Yeah,
there's something of it of like sort of Peter Strickland too, like a Barbarian sound studio in fabric. It's got that sort of like retro feel, doesn't it?
Definitely. And Hayley Squires feels like she belongs in a Peter Strickland film.
Yeah, because she was in Phantom. No, what's it called? Not Phantom Thread.
In the Fabric.
In Fabric. Yeah.
Yeah, of course she was. Yeah.
But yeah, she's great as well. What did you think of her? She's playing quite against type, because usually she plays plays these. She plays these very kind of working class characters, and in extremely naturalistic performances. You know, she's known for that kind of Ken Loach, that Mike Leigh-esque performance, isn't she, in a way, where she sounds unscripted and everything else, whereas, like we said earlier, this character is very scripted, very characterized.
It took a bit of getting used to. I think because I actually interviewed Hayley Squires a few weeks ago because she was nominated for a TV BAFTA, which is very cool, and she's amazing. She's lovely, and I was like, oh, my boyfriend's literally just gone to a screening of In the Earth today, and she was like, did he understand it? And I was like, I think so. And she was like, oh, I did not.
That's brilliant.
So I really love that she was in this. Like that's when I was watching her saying all these really complicated words that I had no idea about. I was like, it's quite cool to know that she had no idea what she was saying.
So funny.
It makes me laugh.
It's like Laura Dern when she was on the red carpet for a David Lynch film in Land Empire, and she was like, I just can't wait to see it to find out if any of it makes sense, because when I was filming it I had no idea what any of these scenes were. It's like brilliant.
But yeah, Hayley's got such a lovely little face. She's so expressive. She has these huge eyes all the way through. She's a very earnest character.
Yes.
Also, everything this again, and I don't know if this is part of the fact that she's supposed to be very performative in it, and that she is. Again, there are boundaries. She's keeping secrets and all the rest of it.
Yeah, you never quite know whether to trust her.
No,
Yeah.
and one of them trusts her and one of them doesn't. Martin does and Alma doesn't. Martin does because he was in love with her. They had a relationship.
That's right.
And Alma doesn't because she doesn't, she's very untrustworthy.
Yes.
This scientist, actually, and you never really get a straight answer. But the way that she talks was slightly annoying because she sort of. She had the same intonation for every single line in the film, and that did bother me a little bit.
Yeah, almost a bit robotic.
It was
Deliberately
robotic,
so, right?
Yeah, it really was. Which maybe she dropped by like the very end scene where everything goes to shit. I was really hoping she was going to die. Hayley Squires' character, not even necessarily at the hands of Alma, which is what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
But I almost wanted her to be punished by whatever it was that she'd been trying to contact. And she doesn't.
No. Does anyone die at the end? Who dies?
Rishi Smith definitely dies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, fine.
That was great. What a fucking great death that was.
Yeah.
So you got so how Rishi Smith dies was one of the best on-screen fun deaths because Alma like shoves something like a hook in his eye, stabs him through the eye, and then he starts trying to pull it out, and he's like, and you just see his eye coming out of the socket, and in my head I was thinking about Dan Martin, and and then he's like, nope, you're gonna have to take me to hospital, which is like what Martin said earlier. It was really funny, and again, that was just a really nice little throwback of humor that was quite unexpected but needed. And then she literally just shoves this hook back into his brain.
So good.
And you just see his foot twitching as he dies, and I think we all cheered.
Oh, I love it.
So satisfying.
I love it.
It was a great death.
Yeah, so good.
I almost clapped.
I mean, the gore, we did sort of touch upon it, but how good is that gore and body horror, particularly the foot as well, right? And the chopping off of the toes.
The toes I kept like almost missing because I kept hiding my eyes.
Yeah,
and then
you don't know when to look away and when not to.
That was so good.
Yeah.
The timing, again, it's, it's not comic timing, it's gory timing, and
it's almost
because
the
they count it down, and then they miss, and they count it down again, and then they miss, and then he does it, and you didn't have a chance to look away.
It's like timing a really great joke.
It's fantastic.
It's really good.
It really
that
was.
gore is very realistic, and it's so nasty.
But do you know what as well? I didn't think I was going to enjoy watching Rishi Smith sew up this foot. And I did.
Yeah.
I wanted to watch it. It was, again, going back to it being tactile, there was something about seeing, maybe because I don't know. It was great. I really enjoyed watching that. And normally I'm awful with anything like slits in the skin. Oof. I really can't. That's one of my worst body horror type things.
There's also the moment, and this is always something that makes me wince, seeing somebody cauterize something.
God.
But when they cauterize, when Hayley Squires cauterizes his foot,
Yeah.
I found that kind of satisfying. And I think just because up until this point, I was
You were so worried
aware-
about it being infected.
Yeah, oh God, the woods. I was just so aware of how much like crap was getting in his foot wound that I was like, yes, fucking cauterize it, you know?
And then he fainted.
Yeah.
I was so glad he'd fainted.
Yeah. And I've never obviously experienced pain like that, but you just know whenever you watch a film and you see somebody, you know, pour alcohol on a wound or you see somebody cauterize something,
Yeah.
you know how painful that is. But at the same time, you kind of know how ultimately good and satisfying that is at the same time. There's something about it, you know? But yeah, all of those moments of gore were just spectacular. And maybe this is a good time now to go to my conversation with Dan Martin, because I had a little chat with
the genius that is Dan Martin.
the genius that is Dan Martin, who, you know, among being a regular contributor on this podcast, did the practical effects for In the Earth, for Possessor, for Censor, for pretty much most of the horrible British horror films with gory scenes that you
He's
might
got
have
such
seen.
an amazing career, Dan Martin.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. So here is my chat with the brilliant Dan Martin. Welcome back to the podcast, Dan Martin. Hello, Dan.
Hello, thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much for being here. How's life? Pretty busy right now, I imagine.
Yeah, it's crazy busy. It kind of hasn't stopped since after the first lockdown, when we only did one movie during the full actual lockdown. It's been non-stop. I think this is... I'm genuinely losing count, but since the first lockdown, I think we're on our 10th feature.
Oh my God.
Like 14th project, something like that.
Incredible. Well, I want to ask you specifically about one of these 14 projects, Dan. I want to ask you a little bit about In the Earth, which you filmed during the pandemic last year with Ben Wheatley. Ben Wheatley, obviously, you've worked with many times before, but tell us a little bit about your involvement in this film and sort of how you got involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a pretty quick turnaround from conception to photography.
Yeah.
And I was contacted, I guess, relatively early in that scale of things, but there wasn't that much time. We had to hit the ground running pretty much. I mean, it was just to put what we were talking about earlier with busyness into perspective, when we filmed this, it was my 4th film since the lockdown started.
Wow. Oh my God. Yeah. And a nice short one, right? It was like, was it 15 days photography?
Yeah. So I was on set for part of it, but because of the schedule and because of other stuff we had going on, I had a fantastic key team running things. So Ros Gomersall, who's my sort of day-to-day workshop manager, and Jess Heath, who comes in and does stuff for us occasionally, both great artists in their own right, ran the day-to-day for me on the film, because obviously they were all bubbled together. And then I would come in for key moments, but be, you know, strenuously tested and so on.
Aha. So you obviously, you've talked on the podcast before about working with Ben. We've covered on this podcast Sightseers and A Field in England, both of which you worked on. And what's really interesting is it feels a bit like this is his return to that era of his career in a way, right? That return to that kind of the horror of the British countryside that so many horror fans loved in his early work, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely, like, the comparisons have been made by many, many people to A Field in England, and I would say that that's probably spiritually... From my perspective, that's the film that it's closest to, even though it's stylistically very different.
Yes.
There are a lot of shared themes, at least in my reading of it, and there are some narrative points that connect the two. I won't say any more on that.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk a bit about your specific involvement and everything, but first of all, I just want to know kind of, as a viewer, as a film fan, Dan, what did you make of In the Earth the first time you sort of saw it?
I really, really enjoyed it. It's we did a sort of online cast and crew screening of it before it played, the night before it played at Sundance.
Aha.
And then we all got on Zoom together and sort of chatted about it afterwards, which was really nice. It's as close to the sort of the proper cast and crew experience as I've managed to find in these weird pandemic times.
Yes.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. It's Ben's first time working with Nick as his DOP instead of Laurie Rose. But I think that Nick managed to bring Ben's vision to the screen really beautifully. It has a lot of the sort of the trippy intercut montage stuff. Again, that's quite a part of Field in England, and I thought that worked really nicely. It didn't feel like retreading the same stuff. Obviously, they're working in a different space. It's a colour film. It's a modern film, but I thought that the aesthetics in that stuff were really, really beautiful. And they filmed a lot more specific elements specifically for those sequences, and I found them quite arresting. I really enjoyed that. I think the soundscape / music in this is absolutely beautiful, and Clint working with Martin Pavey, who did the sound design, have really put together something quite special with that as well. I mean, sound is always a very big part of Ben's films, whether it's his musical collaborators or Martin's work. Martin's sort of been with him for, if not since the beginning, then for the bulk of it. I think maybe since the beginning. But yeah, he put together some really beautiful stuff. I know that on Possessor, not Ben, Martin recorded a bunch of the audio back through human skulls. And and through by like reverb miking people's heads and playing sound back through like the roof of their mouth, so you got the distortion that happens inside a human head. And similarly,
that's amazing.
Clint did a bunch of recording the sort of electromagnetic emissions of plants to get the nature noises really deep into the sound structure of this film. And so working with Martin's attitude as well, just really, it's a really lovely, organic, muddy film.
Tell us about some of these practical effects then, because in the screening I was at, people were wincing, they were gasping. There are some truly gross moments in this. How much fun was it working on this movie?
Yeah, it was really fun. There's like maybe like half a dozen gags in the film. Like there's a bunch of sort of general makeup, scars and ringworm makeups and that kind of thing that we sort of play around with for day to day. But then there are some gags, some events that we got to do. And Ben's such a great collaborator with this stuff, because he's very like he knows what tone he wants, but he's also very open to having his the people he's working with, in this instance me, like pitch things that they think will work. And so he'll it's all in the script, but then I get to say, oh, but also what if we did this element, or what if it looked like this, or whatever. So you still get to be creative within the parameters of what's needed for the story. So yeah, it's definitely very fun working on that stuff.
You mentioned sort of tonally, Ben has very specific kind of thoughts in mind. What do you think sort of tonally he was going for with this? Because, I remember he's talked a lot about, for example, with Kill List, that kind of everything in Kill List is designed to make you feel kind of uncomfortable or uneasy or scared in that very kind of nightmarish, dark way. Is that what he's going for again with this one, would you say? Or is there something sort of different in a kind of in that sort of tonal horror way? Is he going for something a bit different with this movie, do you think?
So Ben hasn't explicitly stated to me at any point what his overarching sort of tonal desires were. And I don't feel it behooves me to just guess. But
yeah, sure.
But I do think that when you're dealing with this kind of thing, like with horror in general, folk horror in particular, or at least it's not even folk horror, because this only very slightly, in my opinion, this only very slightly skirts folk horror. It's much more sort of environmental horror for me. But I do think that it's about the minutiae, and it's about those, this creeping up on you feeling. And that's definitely sort of what I was playing with a lot of the bits that I was working on.
I mentioned already, and I've spoken to Ben himself about this, obviously there are references in this movie to Nigel Neal. Again, personally, I see a lot of folk horror in this, 70s folk horror, particularly like the Owl Service, Children of the Stone, that kind of thing. But I remember when you talked about Kill List, Dan, you said that you and Ben always have a really good almost shorthand, because you both have, cinema so well, you're able to make quick references to each other as almost shorthand for what Ben might want or what you can create. I just wondered, did you have any titles in mind that you guys sort of batted back and forth when you were designing the effects in this film?
To be honest, nothing that really springs to mind. The shorthand existed. I mean, it's how all film nerds talk to one another, I think. but actually, when we were talking about the horror stuff, like the gore, it was much more kind of matter-of-fact descriptor. And I think partly because, with a couple of exceptions, we were sort of playing around with versions of things that weren't necessarily referential.
So tell me, I'd love to ask you, I mean, like, one of the moments that absolutely made me... actually, there's a few different moments, and it's all to do with poor Joel Fry's foot, actually. Like, basically everything to do with that foot. But tell us a little bit about that and, like, achieving that brilliantly directed scene. I think it's so tense as well, but the moment when he is going to chop off the toes and just how prolonged that is. And then, of course, the fact that you do kind of... it does kind of then pay off in that kind of really grisly, gross way. But tell us a little bit about sort of creating that.
Well, it's an interesting one because, like, that sequence is one that kind of germinated during production. So the version that we filmed was slightly different from the script as it started, and it meant a little shift on our end from the practical stuff. So it was one of those ones where it's, we're rushing to finish stuff, and it was really exciting to get it on set. And then it's always such a pleasure to watch Rhys perform. The way Rhys envelops a character is delightful.
He's so good, isn't he? Yeah. Yeah,
and then that tent, like the space, was like living inside Bava's head for me. Like you've got a red wall and a green wall, and they're giving you this beautiful, almost like giallo lighting. Like the space was gorgeous. Felicity Hickson, the production designer, did a beautiful job with that space. And yeah, like we were filming. I'm trying to think how long it took to film that sequence. But it was genuinely difficult not to interrupt a take with laughter with with the way Rhys was playing it. And I think that's one of the things that's so good about that sequence is that it goes it's edging you with horror because it keeps on pulling it back into laughter. And so, like, when you have that moment of tension in a film, the release is almost always either a gasp or a scream or a laugh. Like, those are the two ways in which tension can be dissipated. And so that tension builds, and then it's released a little bit with a laugh at one of Rhys's lines, and then it builds, and then it gets released, and then it builds, and it builds, and it builds, and then the chop. It's beautifully edited.
So wonderful, isn't it? And so gross. And then and things get absolute. And I suppose this is another kind of a way in which people might compare it to A Field in England. It does seem to get more and more nuts, obviously, in its third act as well. It's one of those things where it feels like I need to watch it a second time, to be fair, to kind of fully get my head around kind of what exactly I made of it. But do you, and again, I don't know whether you've spoken to Ben yourself about this or just whether you have your own interpretations about kind of what ultimately this story is and where we kind of end up by the end of the movie as well.
Well, I mean, so this is all personal interpretation going forwards. This was written during the pandemic. This is a time where something we'd never known about has come in and changed all of our lives, which is, as I mentioned earlier, does feel like it's sort of a present motif in some of Ben's work, whether it's the cult in Kill List or or the sort of supernatural space in Field in England, and so you've got this invisible or inaudible to us communication going on in the earth, the idea that, oh, maybe you were being called to this place. You know, the ringworm that he's had in the past is a fungal infection in his skin. And then here is this space with this huge mycorrhizal network running underneath the ground. These like interconnected gestalt entities.
Yes.
And maybe this thing that was in his skin is somehow part of that. And that is what, like, that's the anchor in him. That's the hook in him that draws him into this space. But yeah, like, so it's the idea of this unknown, this invisible force that can tear apart our lives. I think it's not going to date the film, but it's certainly a timely film.
Yes, and there's that lovely balance of sort of what feels like mysticism, you know, religion, and also science, and how all of that is rooted in the ancient earth, right? And how different ways, different characters read or interpret the things in the natural world around us. And that was something that I really loved. There are sides and shades to everything we see through all of these different characters. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an oft said adage that that religion or mysticism is just science yet to be discovered.
Yeah.
And that's very present in this, whether it was something that Ben set out to sort of espouse, the idea that one thing can be examined from two very different angles, they being scientific and spiritual. And so it asks a lot of very interesting questions about the mindset that is, with which these things are approached.
Yes. So there you go. Dan, anything else you want to mention? Any other particular highlights from this whole experience for you, whilst working on this movie that you want to mention or that you want to tell us about?
So this is an off-camera moment that I'm going to tell you about, but it was an absolute delight.
Oh, please.
So it was quite late during the shoot. It was very late at night. We were just about to film the tent peg scene with Reese.
Oh, yes.
And he was in his makeup, and we were in an easy up for the non-film folk in the audience. That is a sort of collapsible four-sided square tent thing that lives on the edge of film set and is used as a sort of keep space when you're out on location. So we had one of those big red rad heaters, the sort of the red light heaters. We had Reese, myself, Jess Heath, Roz, a couple of other crew members, and I knew that Jess was like a big fan of Reese, but I also knew that she was professional enough never to like gush at him about this stuff. And we were waiting probably like 25 minutes maybe from makeup on. We got to set, and then we had like a 25-minute wait before he was on set, and I spotted an opportunity in the way the conversation was going, and we started talking about League of Gentlemen, and Reese started reminiscing about his favourite moments in League of Gentlemen and was drifting through the characters, doing his own lines, doing like Steve's lines, and oh my goodness, it was a delight. And Jess was just in the edge of the tent, like just like
just unable to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my god,
just delighted. And he was such a good sport, but like not even doing it as a sort of like, oh god, here we go, roll out the old stuff. Like he was genuinely like enjoying reminiscing. He's such a sweet guy, but he's still just totally is all of those characters whenever he wants to be, and it was so fun.
And that was what was so cool about this, because not that, Reese is so good and he's so versatile, and I've watched everything he's ever made really as well. I'm a massive fan, but I did think like this particular character I had never seen him do before, and that was actually really nice because he's played characters in other things where I kind of think, oh, that reminds me a little bit of that guy from League of Gentlemen or that guy from Psychoville or whatever, and this really was like he was almost unrecognizable at times, and I loved that about him in this.
Yeah, I think he's the thing that he does so very well, and it's present here and it's present in other stuff, not to in any way like dismiss what you just said. I think you're completely right in that this was a very unique performance for him, but he does righteous indignation so perfectly.
Yeah,
like the utter like confusion as to why people wouldn't be on board with whatever mad shit his character has going on.
Yeah, he goes a bit Annie Wilkes at times in this as well.
I love it.
It's so good. Are you an Inside Number 9 fan, Dan? Have you been watching the
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like any anthology things, you'll prefer some to others.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a great show.
So good. Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me. And, I just want to say again what tremendous work you've done on this film. The practical effects are incredible. And, it must be a real joy as well after, everything that's happened with cinema releases and streaming and everything this last year. What a joy to know that UK audiences here can actually go and see and appreciate this movie and your work on the big screen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to try and get along to the cinema. not that they're packed, at all at the moment. I went to see Spiral, not last weekend, but the one before. There were like 4 or 5 of us in the cinema. I mean, maybe other things at play. But I'd like to. Yeah, I'd really like to see this with a big audience at some point, even if it's not on this first run. But I'm very, very happy that it's getting a cinematic release. It deserves.
I can't wait to see. I'm really intrigued to know what do you think people are going to make of this? Like, just the masses, I suppose.
I don't know. I mean, like, the thing is, Field in England is super divisive. Like,
sure,
you know, and this isn't as hard going as that. For a start, it's in colour.
yeah.
But I do think that it's going to have a similar, its detractors will say similar things to the things that people said about Field in England.
Yes.
And to those people I say, well, you should have watched more carefully because you clearly didn't get it.
It's true. And I really do think, actually, because, I mean, very similarly, I saw A Field in England for the first time when it was on Film 4 on my little TV at the time, and it didn't do much for me. And then when I got to see it again on the big screen, it was like an entirely different experience. I think that's the thing. And In the Earth, I imagine, could potentially be a kind of similar experience, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think you want to choose your cinema by its sound system for this one.
Yes.
Like, it's obviously big screen, but that's kind of a given with a cinema. But go somewhere with a good sound system.
Yes, absolutely. So there you go. Dan, thank you so much for this. It's been such a joy, and I can't wait to hear what other people make of this film. I'm sure it's going to be sort of a film that people are going to talk about quite a lot over the upcoming months.
I think so.
But like so many films that you work on as well, I mean, you get to do such interesting stuff. Before you go, is there anything you've got coming up or any movies coming out that you've worked on that you can tell us about yet?
Well, I mean, it's a quietish period at the moment. We've got some bits coming up, though. Prano Bond's Censor, fresh from Sundance, is coming up, which I'm very, very excited for people to see. Obviously, I've had a little insight into the In the Earth response because it's come out in the States, but Censor is, I cannot wait for that one to be out.
I did see, by the way, and I know we've probably messaged about this, but I saw at, what was it, Sundance? No, South by Southwest, I saw Broadcast Signal Intrusion.
Oh, yes, of course.
Which I fucking loved as well. It was so good. And have you actually seen the film yet? Have you had a chance to watch it yet?
I've watched the movie.
Yes.
I love it. I'm very pleased to have been part of it. I don't know what the release schedule for that one is.
No. It's a Fright Fest. A Fright Fest are involved in it, right? Is it a Fright Fest Presents or something like that?
It may be, yeah.
I'm hoping that maybe it will get a UK premiere at Fright Fest in the summer, but I've no idea yet. But yeah, just wanted to say hats off on that as well, because also you directed some of the sequences in that as well, didn't you?
Yeah, the nightmares, the titular intrusions.
Oh my god,
are all mine. So they shot the bulk of the film in Chicago. It's the same production company who did Girl on the Third Floor.
Yes, that's right.
And they asked me if I could be involved, but it wasn't going to work out me heading over there to film. And we were sort of costing it up. And it was Jen Handorf, my wife, who said, well, financially, why don't you pitch directing those sequences here as a second unit? Giles, who works for the company, is London-based, UK-based.
Giles Edwards, right?
Giles Edwards,
He's
yeah.
been on this podcast a few times. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course, yes, of course he has.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, Giles was sort of like producing over here for us. So Jennifer and him took on production duty, and then I got to work with one of my favourite creature performers, James Swanton.
Yes.
Came in to be our mechanical lover.
Mm-hmm.
And and I got to direct the nightmare sequences. And actually, there's a short film version of just those sequences that will surface at some point after the film has been
amazing.
released. So
Oh, fantastic. Well, I can't wait for people to see that movie as well. Well, Dan, thank you so much. And in the meantime, just let people know where they can find you if they want to come and chat to you or ask you questions on social media or wherever else.
thank you so much. On Twitter, I am at 13fingerfx, and the same on Instagram. And of course, every 2 weeks, myself and Sam Ashurst discuss films on the Arrow Video podcast as well. So you can hear us wittering about more things there.
Love it. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
There we go. The amazing Dan Martin. Always brilliant. Such a joy to chat to. Okay, we're going to wrap up on In the Earth shortly. But Rhianna, first of all, any other moments you want to mention? Any weaknesses of the film? Anything you didn't like? Anything you particularly loved that we haven't talked about yet?
So something else that kind of I think I was maybe slightly surprised because it's kind of a typical trope of horror, and I feel like Ben Wheatley does quite a good job of not doing tropes.
Yeah.
In this film especially, but when Martin accepts like drinking mushroom milk or whatever that Hayley Squires has made up for him, because basically she convinces them both to be part of her final ritual to finally connect with this being, and then so he actually then downs this stuff, and then it turns out that she's been collaborating with old Zach the whole time, and he comes to try and slit Martin's throat, and then when he doesn't succeed and good old Alma comes to the rescue. I love Alma so much.
She was the hero of this film because actually
yeah.
Martin was pretty weak and useless from beginning to end, right?
Yeah.
He was a great character, but he was very passive, like you've just said. Like, I kind of could believe that he would drink that milk because every step of the way he never really stood up for himself. He never really did anything that people weren't telling him to do, really.
And I think Alma's frustration with him was good because she was like, you can see why it's relevant. Your relationship with this woman is relevant. And he's like, I don't want to talk about it. It's private. And he, you know, Rishi Smith has read his diary.
Yeah.
Like, all very candid.
Yeah.
So he's like, he almost like reverts to being like a teenager when he's around Hayley Squires' character. Yeah. You're just like, you just want to shake him and be like, oh my God, you've been through so much. You owe Alma like to get out. And he just can't quite tear himself away. And then I suppose Hayley Squires' character makes quite an interesting point about the fact that he's been brought here.
I think I'd need to go back and revisit it to kind of fully make up my mind about that last 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah. It's just that there's the very last line of the film is Alma. Again, you think that Martin's been killed by Hayley Squires at this point, but he hasn't. And Alma goes up to him and is at the very end in a really sort of like dead behind the eyes way. It's just like, I'll show you out of the woods.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like, oh my God, what's happened?
Yeah.
What's happened to her?
Has she been embodied by the beast? Yeah.
But again, I don't know. Maybe she saw the way out when she had her hallucinations. Who knows?
Yeah. Or she's just completely off her nut and was never going to show him out of the woods, you know. Yeah, you can read it into a million different ways. Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about it. That's why I can't wait to watch it again.
Yeah. I think everyone who watches it will have their own take, and that's always really nice when you're not handed on a plate.
Yes.
What happens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Favourite bit?
I loved all the stuff with Rishi Smith in a tent.
So good.
And just all those three like vibing off each other, and
yeah, I think that is when it's at its best.
Yeah.
The three of them awkwardly, like you said, it kind of could have almost been a little Inside Number 9 episode, that middle section.
Yeah.
those three just being so natural and so weird and so awkward, and it is really extreme and far-fetched but sort of believable, and that is what Ben Wheatley is so good at. It's like Sightseers, it's like Kill List, it's like these stories are very far-fetched, but they're done in a way that feels so like a kitchen sink British drama.
They're so British.
Yeah.
Like all of their sensibilities, like you said about like him just being like polite and pressed and then even them being like, oh, we're going to die, aren't we?
Yeah.
But yeah, I do. I really loved just the way that he brought in humour from other like tropey other things like the guitar, like the like, oh, this is my hand-picked elderflower cordial, and the dark room stuff, and when he was talking about photography, like a photography wanker, and oh, have you ever developed your own film? It's a real rush, all that kind of stuff. You know, all that dialogue was absolutely brilliant and just felt so unexpected in a film like this.
And also there was something in that too, I think, that obviously fits all the themes we're talking about, because he sort of says it's basically magic, right? That photography, how it works, and again, it's that same thing we were just trying to figure out. It's that riding of the line between like actual nature and something magical or supernatural, and that sometimes there can actually be quite a fine line in a way that it is almost like some sort of alchemy, what's happening, you know, how things work, I suppose, like photography and that kind of thing. And
there are lots of podcasts I could point him to. They'll explain it all.
Yeah, but it's cool. I love all of that about it. I love everything about this film. It was so good.
Yeah,
so good.
I'm really glad I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you enjoyed it as well.
I would have been really gutted, I think, if I'd seen this and hated it. Like, that would have been a real shame.
Yeah, well, I was so pleased in a way that you were going to come see it at because we almost watched a screener, didn't we?
Yeah.
We got sent a screener, and you were going to watch that, and I was like, wait, hold off, we're going to go to Brighton and see it on the big screen, because I just knew that if you watched it on a laptop, it would not be the same. Yeah. So there you go. Well, thank you for taking the time to discuss this weird, fucked up movie with me.
You are welcome. Is that because you couldn't find anyone else?
No.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, pleasure. And so just remind us where people can find you and more of your stuff out there online.
Well, I'll, be talking about horror films and all the weird, bizarre shit that you talk about on your podcast on Six Music every Monday morning with Laura and Laverne on The Breakfast Show. Yeah,
you're more in the heights than in the earth over there on Six Music.
Yes, I am. Unashamedly.
Yeah, In the Heights is also fucking great, to be fair.
It's great. Let's do a podcast on that next. Yes, so I've got a podcast out at the moment for the British Independent Film Awards, BIFA, called This Is My Cinema, where me and Michael Leader, who is also the co-host of Bibliothèque, if you listen to that, we like interview actors and filmmakers each week as they kind of go through like the cinema experiences and the films that made them growing up and their influences, and talking about their careers. And yeah, it's a really lovely podcast. So if you get a chance to listen to that, do.
Very cool. Also, Patreon subscribers have been writing in saying, when is your next Hitchcock episode? So keep a listen out, because we need to do that soon. We're doing you've been very busy, to be fair.
So yes,
I have apologized to people and said you've been very busy, but we're going to be doing Rear Window and Vertigo. That's our next double bill over on Patreon.
It's a big one. I'm really excited about talking about Rear Window. I could talk about that for days.
And I'm really excited to talk about Vertigo, which I could talk about for days. So there you go. That'll be good.
Perfect.
Until next time then. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's guests, my co-host Rhianna Dhillon, and interviewees Ben Wheatley and Dan Martin. What a treat to be joined by such talented people this week to discuss this incredible film, which I love so much. I already cannot wait to watch it a second time. What did you guys think of In the Earth, though? I know this is the sort of film that may divide audiences. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email us, evolutionofhorror evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. We've also got a discussion group that's called the Evolution of Horror Discussion Group. You can find that on Facebook. There you can discuss horror movies and anything else horror related with fellow listeners. Don't forget, we are currently in the middle of our Aliens series, and you can find new episodes dropping every single Friday for that. This Friday, we're going to be exploring Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 and its remake from 1978. That was such a fun discussion discussing those two movies back to back. So make sure you subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so you can keep up to date. And you can revisit all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast by looking through our back catalogue on our website, evolutionofhorror.com. If you get a spare couple of minutes, please do leave us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again very soon for another episode of The Evolution of Horror.